Thank you all for joining us today for the first of our public programs of this program year. We are happy to be back and chatting with you all. We hope that folks had a restorative summer in some way at one point or another. I know that might feel like a long time ago now. But thank you for joining us for today's conversation, Advocating for Democracy, a Jewish Grassroots Approach, hosted by the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. I'm Christine Gallagher. I'm the Program Director for Teachers here at ICJS, and I'm really excited today to have a conversation with Jews United for Justice's Maryland Organizing Director and Montgomery County Director, Laura Wallace, about how our religious values can inform our work to strengthen our democracy. So we'll start today with 30 to 40 minutes of discussion, and then turn it over for audience questions. We ask that during the conversation, folks keep their microphones on mute. We enjoy this way of having a Zoom call instead of a webinar to be able to see folks, but you'll see that Laura and I are spotlighted here. So we ask that you remain on mute throughout the call. If you have questions, please enter them into the chat. Some fellow staff members here at ICJS will be collecting those throughout the presentation, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible during our Q&A time. As many of you know, the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, here we're working on ensuring the future of an interreligious society. We know that religious difference is integral to life here in the United States. Our country was founded upon the promise of religious liberty for all and the possibility of diverse religious communities, and for those with no religious belief to build a shared future. That promise seems to be under attack more and more with growing incidences of religious bias, bigotry, and hate, and threats to our democracy. So what can we do to combat the attacks on our democracy? And how does leaning into our religious values help us with that work? We know that we need to be louder about the fact that democracy is an interfaith issue, and we need to build broader and deeper coalitions of inspired, capable champions for religious pluralism from diverse sectors of society. So we are thrilled to have one of those champions with us today. Laura Wallace joined the staff of Jews United for Justice 6 years ago. She works with the Maryland organizing team to coordinate JUFJ's statewide campaigns and Montgomery County campaigns. She's led the team effort for ballot questions to increase representation and create a fairer tax code, the Fight for $15 campaign in Montgomery County, and the campaign for sick leave at both the county and state levels. She's worked for a number of Jewish organizations, and she lives in Montgomery County with her husband and 2 children. Laura, welcome to ICJS, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be with you all.
Great. Laura, can you introduce the mission and work of JUFJ for our audience? I know some folks might be familiar with you all, and some folks might be hearing about you for the first time.
Absolutely. So Jews United for Justice, or JUFJ for short, we are close to our 25th anniversary. So we began in DC because the Jewish community in DC really saw that there was so much excitement and activism and attention paid to what was happening at the national level. But meanwhile, at the same time, there were so many critical issues happening to the people who were living in DC itself, and especially with the lack of representation for people in DC, that these folks wanted to come together to not just be active at the federal level, but to really take on those issues in DC itself. So over 25 years, JUFJ has really grown. We now work in DC and also across Maryland. So we have chapters based in Montgomery County and in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and then together coming, anchored in those Montgomery County and Baltimore chapters, we do work at the state level with advocates coming from Anne Arundel County and Howard County and Prince George's County and other places across Maryland. So our goals are to move forward economic, social, and racial equity at the local level. We work to educate and mobilize our Jewish community and also our allies And we focus on issue-based campaigns that make real and concrete improvements in people's lives. So when we talk about sick leave, when we talk about $15 minimum wage, we talk about paid family medical leave for people welcoming a child, taking time off if they're sick. When we talk about mental health supports, fair wages for domestic workers, all of these types of campaigns are really intended to really make that meaningful change in people's lives for their lives to be better. And part of our work is organizing our base, educating our leaders, really helping to grow the community we need to advocate and push for those changes that we want to see in the world. And that's both within the Jewish community and in partnerships with many other communities from all different identities. And we really try to prioritize working with partner organizations that are made up and led by those who are most impacted by the issues that we work on. So when we work in Maryland on immigration issues, we make sure that we partner with groups like CASA, which is one of the leading immigrants' rights organizations, both in this region and more across the country, and making sure that we are hearing the stories of people that are facing, whether it's housing issues, immigration issues, policing issues, what they're experiencing every day, and making sure that our solutions and our strategies are coming out of that lived experience.
Great. Thank you so much. I love that idea of growing the community that we need, right? And making sure that folks who are involved in that growth are, on the ground experiencing what's happening. And so thank you so much for that. Can you talk a little bit about how you got involved with JUFJ?
Sure. So I grew up in Texas, and I grew up in a family that affiliated with the conservative movement in Judaism. And some of my, we were always a very politically involved family. And so some of my earliest memories are sort of my parents like talking at the TV when it came time for, various elections and, knowing all about Ann Richards and some of these like, big figures in Texas politics. And so that engagement in questions of voting, democracy, being civically active, that was always part of my upbringing, as well as very much that basis in Jewish practice. I went to a Jewish day school through my preschool to elementary school years, and then continued to be really involved in various Jewish spaces, including groups like Hillel when I was in college and so forth. My experience of advocacy when I was young was very much through direct service, which was really meaningful. And as I came into my adulthood in the synagogue I first belonged to in Montgomery County, they did both direct service work, but also very much advocacy work. So they were part of a group called Action in Montgomery, which is part of the local industrial areas foundation chapter. Apologies. Challenges of Zoom, so you might hear my dog in the background, which I'm sorry about. The Industrial Areas Foundation does community-based organizing where congregations of all different faiths come together to make change and to advocate for different systemic change. They have chapters across the world, really. In Baltimore, it's Build, in Howard County, it's Path. In DC, it's WIN. So my synagogue, being part of AIM, I saw for the first time that you could bring together people of, who really cared about having a community that met the needs of the people who live there and demand for changes in how the systems were. So I have a very vivid memories of like 1,200 of us in a church with the county executive at the front and saying that half-day kindergarten is not enough. We need full-day kindergarten for our children. And Doug Duncan, who was the county executive at the time, agreed. There was clearly a lot of other work that went into him agreeing for all-day kindergarten. But the fact that, and this is, primarily people coming from institutions of faith and talking about their shared values and saying that because of those values and wanting to have a community where everyone has what they need to live and thrive, therefore pressuring our elected officials to make those policy changes that we needed in order to give everybody those opportunities. And I just found it so incredibly moving. It really resonated with what I grew up in terms of understanding around my Jewish faith and what I felt was a very compelling vision and way of being Jewish in the world. I think of like there's Rabbi Hillel, one of our great sages, says we're not supposed to separate ourselves from the community. And that, there's not, even though we might be worried about our family or our synagogue, that like a separation of the community is actually not in our best interest. Being part of the community is much more powerful. And then there's another quote that I think of a lot from Jeremiah, which is, seek the welfare of the city to which I've exiled you, pray to God on its behalf, for in its prosperity you shall prosper. Oh, I saw someone can't hear. All right, I'll try to be a little louder. And so when we're thinking about, again, the welfare of the city where we live, we're not just talking about the micro, we're talking about the macro. How is the city itself thriving, and that we're called on to be part of creating a city and a larger community that thrives. And so as I was, going through different stages in my career and figuring out what was next for me, when there was this opportunity at JUFJ to be part on a daily basis of that work, to connect to the community and create a community where everyone prospers and all of our prosperity is tied up together, was just incredibly powerful. And so I've just really been thrilled to be part of JUFJ staff for 6 years, be part of this work of creating a community where everyone has what they need by doing this systemic change work, which has both, and we'll talk about it clearly a lot more, but it definitely has its roots in the democratic process, as well as all of the work that we do on the issue education side.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I feel a kinship towards you in a similar background story of, getting involved in the direct service piece, and then sort of moving beyond that as I grew up and was introduced to more of the education side of things and being able to talk about things. But again, like connecting to these values that had been instilled within me early on, and that I had seen early on, and the importance of building across religious lines, and the example that we see in doing that. And I just think of my own story of growing up in my Catholic faith, and how some of those values, especially of looking at the city and building the city and being with folks, has been really important to my work too. So yeah, can we expand a little bit on this idea of the religious values, and sort of how do religious values help inform your involvement in building democracy, or in democracy work in general, and sort of talk about some of those things that some of your religious values that you personally really turn to in fortifying this work for you?
Absolutely. So I absolutely see it. And I think this is true in how we talk about it at JUFJ as well, as being incredibly tied together. So when we think about our civic engagement, first of all, there is a lot of examples throughout our sacred text about the importance of leaders and what leaders mean, and examples of strong leadership. One of the stories that we like to point to is there's some stories about Moses, about Moshe, one of the great leaders in our tradition and in many of our shared traditions. And there's stories about when he sees the people are slaves. There are 2 stories that sort of talk about different ways for Moses to address the concerns of seeing his fellow people enslaved. One of those stories, Moses sort of goes through and redistributes like the burdens, the physical burdens. So if someone is overburdened, we'll take some and give it to someone who looks like they can take on more. If someone's younger, maybe they'll have a bigger burden than someone who, has an ailment of some sort. And it's really very much sort of moving it around so people can only have what they can handle. And then there's a second story where Moses lobbies God to say, look how hard your people are working. They deserve rest. There should be a day of rest. There should be a Shabbat that everybody should have. And lobbies Pharaoh as well, and does manage to win in this story a Shabbat, a day of rest for all of the slaves. And so as I'm thinking about, and we're talking to our community about how we engage in the world, and how we make a difference, looking at some of those models from our tradition, and knowing that sometimes what we need to do is like really get in the minutia and move the burdens around. And sometimes what we need to do, again, if we're talking about that, like, the place for direct service and the place for the systemic change, sometimes what we need to do is get a Shabbat and a day of rest for everybody. And it really can help us feel that connection and that example of where our tradition can help illuminate for us how we can make a difference. And then just to take it a step further, the connection that we see to the civic engagement and to the elections is we really believe that our values, I believe personally, and this is what we try to model at JUFJ, that when we are choosing who we vote for, that it isn't a theoretical experiment, right? That we are voting our values, and the vision that we have, if we are going to create that community that works for everybody, the choices that we make in the voting booth have a direct impact on whether or not those values are lived out into our communities. And this is both true for candidates, individual candidates we vote for, and it's true for one of the things we'll talk a little bit about today is ballot questions. And so ballot questions also make a huge impact. And so how are we coming at these questions of what we are voting for, and also like what we're working to accomplish in terms of moving some of these ballot questions forward? How are those an outgrowth of those values to help create the conditions that make it possible for people to really thrive? And so just the last thing that I'll say about it is that we also see like that there's a real responsibility for people of faith to be thinking about our role in the civic engagement process and how it does, it's really, again, these themes of like strengthening the community and creating the community that we need, and that all of the actions we take around the process of making elections free and fair, and giving and voter education, and making sure people know what their choices are and what is at stake, which I know we'll talk about a little bit more today about what's at stake right now, that all of that kind of civic education and helping people to connect the dots between that democracy work and like the real conditions of their lives, that is part of the sacred civic education work that we feel called to do.
Yeah, I'm curious. And, in the introduction that I gave, I mentioned a few of the campaigns that you had worked on and been successful with. And, I think oftentimes when folks are in the midst of these campaigns and really working to think about it, the values might not be these religious values might not feel as in the forefront as we might think of. So in reflecting on some of these successes that you have had, how do you see or afterwards, or do you think about like those connections there, those values and how you are living them out, and how often do you reflect on that in the work that you are doing?
Yeah, so one of the unique and important roles that Jews United for Justice plays in all of our coalition spaces and all of our issue work and our democracy work is bringing that values voice. So every time we write a piece of testimony, we include Jewish framing. Every time we have a meeting, we begin with some sort of grounding in our text and tradition, or where we are in the holiday calendar. In fact, Ben Sachs, who is on the call right now, has provided some of that framing for us in some of our meetings. And we did a civic education program for the primary that we called What's at Stake. It was primarily focused on Montgomery County, but also the statewide races. And we're in the process of updating it for the general election, which we'll be making widely available for people who want to take a look at who's on the ballot for the general election in Maryland, especially top of the ticket. What are their roles? What kind of impact do they have? And some stories about the ways that the role of governor, the role of attorney general, the role of comptroller have impacts on that issue work that we're trying to do and that system change work we're trying to do. And that whole program is wrapped in that values frame.
Yeah.
So it really is something that we're trying to constantly forefront. Because again, it is something that we can really provide. There are lots of experts, lawyers, people who really have all of the weeds and nuances of all the policies. And a lot of our folks know all of those nuances too. And if every time we talk to legislators, if every time we talk about why an issue matters, we bring that values frame with us, it really gives a really powerful grounding. And again, is part of what makes us, what we bring to the table.
Yeah, I think that's so important, regularly reminding people of that grounding, because sure, like these issues are affecting our everyday life, but, oftentimes we see over and over again how religion is sort of pushed from that everyday life and not really talked about as much. And so to remind people that values voice, I think is so important in bringing it back to people. So you mentioned the importance of thinking about what's at stake. So let's talk about that a little bit now. I mentioned a little bit about the urgency of the moment and why it's important to be thinking now. So why is it important to be aware of the local, what's going on? Why is there especially some urgency to that? And you can speak both from your experience and the moment now and what you are what JUFJ is advocating for now. So why is it important for our democracy to get involved locally, and why is there that extra urgency now?
Great. So just a couple of things that we're constantly thinking about in terms of the democracy work at the local level. First of all, at the local level, every single vote matters, and that is not an exaggeration.
Yeah.
In Frederick County, the council president race was literally won by one vote in the primary that just concluded. Every vote matters. And so when we do our What's at Stake program, I think we say that like 12 times over the course of the program. In Montgomery County, the county executive primary was just decided by 32 votes. Johnny O in Baltimore County won, not this most recent primary, but 4 years ago with 17 votes. Right? Like truly every vote matters. And so however people are voting, the important thing is that people are involved and they take an interest and they are educated as to the candidates and the issues. And sometimes it can feel, and this is something we try to teach, it can feel so disempowering what happens at the national level sometimes. It feels, even though geographically to those of us in the DMV and in Baltimore, it is pretty close geographically, sort of psychologically can feel far away or like it's so hard to impact it. But here in our local races, those Board of Education races, those county council races, and even those statewide races in Maryland, those are decided by such small margins. And so engaging our community and helping them feel that power that they have and how important it is for them to participate, I think is incredibly critical, and just something that is such a difference in those local elections versus the federal. We just went through a redistricting process, which also was hugely impactful. We saw actually Baltimore City losing some of its representation at the state level. And so there are ways for us as a community to be involved in the redistricting process when it happens every 10 years. And once it happens, as it has just done, to educate our community about their new districts and their new legislators and what it means for them. So JUFJ, together with the Baltimore Jewish Council, held a redistricting education event over the summer, especially focused on folks from Baltimore to understand what were those changes in the statewide redistricting, what did it mean for them? And in Montgomery County, we both got involved in testifying in favor of a particular map that we felt like most advanced equity in Montgomery County. The new map has 6 of the 7 districts are majority minority, which reflects the diversity of Montgomery County. Yes. For the first time, there is a district that is a plurality of Black voters and one that is a plurality of Latinx voters. Again, this reflects the reality in Montgomery County. This is the first time that those voting districts have existed. A second piece that we really think about at the local level, how it's so important is public financing. So we've been involved in almost every jurisdiction we've worked in, Baltimore, Montgomery County, DC, on trying to make sure that there is public financing options available for candidates, because that in terms of equity, having the availability for small dollar donors to be able to leverage that through governmental funds into the into the ability for people to be able to run when they don't have personal resources is just incredibly important. And so we both need communities to be lobbying for public financing and to help continue to improve them. There's some real drawbacks to Montgomery County's public financing program. Yeah. It is a much harder program to navigate than the one in DC. And there's ones coming online in Prince George's, there's one in Howard County, there's ones coming online in Baltimore as well. And so we as community members can really help to track how those public financing programs are working and lobby for the fixes, as we're doing in Montgomery County, to try to make those systems do what they're supposed to, which is increase equity and not overly advantage the folks with deep pockets or people that are really relying on those big business or corporate donors. And then the one other sort of like bigger picture thing I'll say before I can talk about some of the details this cycle is access to voting. So again, we might think of that as a problem. That's not a DC and Maryland problem, like that's a problem in Georgia. Actually, there are continuing to be ballot access questions locally as well. This is especially true for like people who are incarcerated. This can be true for people who have transportation issues. We have a very, very robust now vote by mail system that is very easy to use, and making sure people know about it. And there was a legislation that was passed by the General Assembly so that they could count the mail-in ballot votes early, like during the early voting, not wait until election day, but Governor Hogan vetoed it. And so it meant that they couldn't start counting those mail-in ballots until after election day, which means, especially in Montgomery County, where there's a very high use of mail-in ballots, that it took weeks and weeks and weeks to finalize, because then there was a recount as well, because those margins were so close. And so we only just found out who the final candidate is for county executive in Montgomery County, which puts the whole system back in terms of then printing out the general election ballots and getting those out to us on time. So making sure that people are knowledgeable, have access, and that there aren't some of those systemic barriers to being able to have the vote. Those are all things that we're looking at, from year to year to year.
Yeah, we saw that statewide with the governor's race, right? And waiting to see what the mail-in ballots showed from that. We saw it in Baltimore City with the state's attorney's race, and how that took a few days to shake out and see who our state's attorney candidates were. So so we're seeing that over and over again.
Yeah. So then in terms of this general election cycle, so just a couple things I wanted to lift up for you all. The first is, I would be remiss if I didn't give dates, which I'm sure you all know, but dates are very important. So early voting is October 27th through November 3rd, and election day is on November 8th. And you can request a mail-in ballot up until just a week before early voting. And then you can always request a mail-in ballot in person if you choose at any early voting or the primary or the general election day site. So we always like to make sure that everyone knows when those dates are.
Good first step in thinking about the election, knowing when the election is. Yes.
That's one of the reasons the primary was so tough this summer.
Yes.
Because they kept moving the date. Because so we talked about redistricting. So the census results came late, which then meant the redistricting process got started late. And then there were legal challenges at almost all levels of the redistricting. And so by the time those legal challenges were resolved and the maps were resolved, then we had to move all of the dates for the primary. And we had a middle of July primary, which everyone's on vacation at the beach. People weren't paying attention. So really challenging. So hopefully it'll be a little easier since this will be a regular November timing. So 2 ballot questions I wanted to bring to your all's attention that are on the ballot for the general election. One is in Baltimore City, question H. And so when we look at what kinds of work we can do as nonprofits, being supportive of ballot questions is, to use a sort of a Jewish turn of phrase, kosher. I just kosher for C3s and nonprofits and houses of worship to support ballot questions. You can't support candidates, but you can support ballot questions. So Jesus United for Justice has the position of being for question H in Baltimore City. And basically right now, Baltimore City does not have local control of its own police department. The state of Maryland has control over Baltimore City's police department. That has been true since the mid 1800s. There is a whole lot of racism baked into the reason why there's not local control. And it's the only jurisdiction in Maryland and only one of 2 in all of the US that doesn't have local control. It has been a multi-year battle to even get local control on the ballot. And so the fact that we've gotten this far is amazing. And so we really are encouraging people to vote in favor of question H on the ballot in Baltimore City. So happy to talk more about that in the Q&A, but that is one of the ballot questions that we're really focused on. And the second ballot question we're focused on is in Howard County. And so this is also voting for question A in this case. And this is because there was legislation that was passed in Howard County that protected the information of immigrants, especially people that are undocumented, so that the school rolls and if you go to the hospital or take, have any sort of social services, get support with your rent, that you couldn't then have federal immigration sources combing through local support systems to try to find people's records to then be able to, target them. And so in Howard County, they passed this legislation. And now there's an attempt to overturn it with this ballot question. So voting for question A will keep these protections in place, will keep people's information private so they can go to the police if they feel like they have to, so they can get healthcare, so they can access schools, so they can access other community services that they need without feeling like they could be at risk. So that is something where I mentioned CASA before. We're working with CASA on that and with our many partners on the Baltimore City one. There's many other ballot questions on both locally and at the state level. Those are the 2 that we're particularly focused on. And then the one last thing I'll say about the urgency of this particular election is we have found that so much of what we try to pass, both at the local and the state level, then when the decision makers, the electeds, have so much control over the implementation and the timeline, and whether or not they get implemented in the robust way that they were intended, or if they are scaled back in some way. And so we're really thinking, for instance, about paid family medical leave. We just got a wonderful policy passed in Maryland that gives 12 weeks of leave for people who are sick, or someone in their family is sick, or they're welcoming a child, whether that be a child by birth or fostering or any other adoption. And we are now in a 2-year implementation phase for paid family medical leave. So who the governor is and who the General Assembly members are have a huge impact on whether or not that legislation is going to be the strongest version of itself or significantly scaled back. And so when people go to vote, we're really encouraging them to think about issues like paid family medical leave and how they will be impacted by who our next leaders are.
Yeah, as a former teacher, I was following along quite closely with the Kerwin Commission information, and then what happened with that, with the follow through on that. You talked a little bit about CASA and working with other organizations and engaging other organizations. Can you expand a little bit on why it's important to build strong networks of supporters and activists to help in this work? And how do you think we can, what sort of tips can you give for building those connections, for building out your own at JUFJ, and then also building some partnerships with other organizations too?
Yeah. Absolutely. So all of this work is done in coalition. Our executive director likes to talk about how we're in the best version of our work. We're necessary, but not sufficient. There's nothing that we can accomplish on our own. We're never sufficient on our own, but how do we contribute in a way that makes us necessary as part of those spaces, especially as we talked about earlier, bringing in some of those values. And so everything that we do is in those partnerships. The foundation for that is relationships. So that's relationships with other advocates, that's relationships with people who are experiencing the issues that we're working on, that's relationships with each other at JWFJ, both leaders and staff. And really, hearing each other's stories, understanding where people are coming from and what is motivating them to do the work. That is the foundation. And then our positionality in these spaces is to really try to make sure we're listening, especially, so something like paid family medical leave, almost everybody in JWFJ has experienced either themselves or someone close to them the need for paid family medical leave. We are full of those stories. There's some issues like immigration where we have a lot of family stories in our community, right? People have their immigration stories, whether they were coming over because of World War II or they were coming over more recently. All of those stories about the immigration in their family, but many members of our community aren't recent immigrants. They themselves are not immigrants. They, it's their parents or their grandparents or their great grandparents. So by being in relationship with groups like CASA and hearing what the issues are for people who are immigrants today, then helps us be able to tie both some of our foundational stories, right? Again, going back to Moses and the Exodus, right? Like stories of immigration back from our whole tradition with our more recent stories, and then hearing what people are needing today and being able to tie those together. Then that is really important part of the work. So that's a lot of listening, a lot of understanding other people's strategy and not always assuming that our solutions or strategies are the right ones, but that we're really hearing from people that are facing these questions every day. And there's also a piece of it, which is about doing the education work, the civic education work together. So the What's at Stake program that I mentioned before, we did for a number of synagogues, but we also did for partners. We also did it, for example, for nonprofit Montgomery, trying to make sure some of these civic engagement and education tools we've created are widely available, because not everyone has the resources to put them together. And we also have other programs about how does the General Assembly work in Maryland? How does, the
important foundational work.
Exactly. And then the other thing that we make sure that isn't that we're, so for the work, like the ballot question work, you had mentioned in my intro, the ballot questions in Montgomery County in 2020. So we helped anchor a coalition for that involved everybody who was willing to participate. There were some really critical ballot questions there about tax code and about representation. And we had interfaith communities, we had labor unions, we had the realtors joined us for that one, Chamber of Commerce, right? We had everybody came to the table to really try to work together on those ballot questions. And all of that, right, is based around those relationships. And the one other thing that is not as core to what JFJ does every day, but I think is really valuable as places of worship and people of faith are looking at getting involved in these questions, is groups like Baltimore Votes, which really does wonderful voter engagement work and education work, and doing that civic engagement from that, from that perspective, I think is also really powerful as people are trying to, communicate with their communities about what's at stake and how people can get engaged.
Yeah, I have volunteered with Baltimore Votes, and I will echo that for sure. That question or that statement leads me to a question that we have, and I'm going to remind folks that if you have questions, you can put them in the chat I was sent this one separately. So if religious communities are wanting to help their areas to be more knowledgeable about voting and have more access to information about voting, how would you recommend they start? So thinking about like how religious communities can go about doing that.
Yeah. So of course, always start with the people that you know, the people that are in your community themselves. So having an education program where people can, talk about the upcoming elections or talk about some of these questions, whether it's redistricting or whether it is, public financing. And then really one of the things that we've tried to do is empower people to then go beyond the folks that are already self-selecting and coming in to talk to JOFJ by providing slides and recordings and other things that people can take out and share with their community. And certainly that we're by the beginning of October, we should have our what's at stake for the general election completed. So if there's anybody who specifically is interested in talking with us about using our materials or partnering with us on that, we're happy to work on that. But I think that but starting with your own community, helping people know some of the basics so they like feel that they know even where to see who's on the ballot. Some of those down ballot races like Board of Ed, it's very hard to even know where to look. Forums, I know there's a number, so we try to do a roundup of some forums. There's other groups like League of Women Voters is really excellent about this, providing forums, giving people information about forums that are happening and helping to be, empowering them to educate themselves is also really powerful. Again, especially for those down ballot races. So I think it is starting close to home, building out from that. And then the other way to do it is, again, looking for partners. So if you know that there is another house of worship, down the street that you have a relationship with, maybe that's a program that you do together. Or if you have a school that's associated, some sort of religious school associated with your, house of worship or your institution, then how are you helping to educate students and parents together to help empower them? So looking for those opportunities to expand the folks that are getting involved and in conversation.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've either tuned into a forum or attended a forum. One of the last things I did before the world shut down for COVID was I attended a forum with the mayoral candidates in the primary in 2020 here in Baltimore. And it was run by a bunch of young people, first-time voters. And I realized that one of my former students was one of the people running it after I got there. And it was like such a wonderful moment to see her involved in that work. But you're so right that, we are inundated with stories about politics, and it's everywhere you go. It's every conversation that you seem to have with people, but setting up some time to do a lot of this foundational work and take a step back from the noise and really focus in on those foundations is so important to what we're doing, I think, and what you all are doing, and how we need to sort of think about maybe how to fortify democracy in the midst of all of this. I have a question to go from someone to go back to our discussion on values. So values give you a general guidance for principles, but sometimes choices for policy positions are not so clear. Can you think of an example where you wrestled with how to pick the right policy that would represent your values?
Yeah. It's a great question. So I think I'm trying to think of a good example here. So sometimes it's a question of maybe it might be clear to us like the overall goal, but how to get to the goal can sometimes be a little bit tricky. And so like thinking about a few years ago now, but thinking when we were doing the Fight for 15 and working to raise minimum wage. and talking to people who believed that people should be able to, if they had a job, should be able to afford to take care of themselves, but also some people who were small business owners that also were worried about making payroll and like what it meant for themselves and how were they able to, have their values of running their business and paying their employees if they were worried that the minimum wage was going up in a way that wasn't sustainable for them. So I think where we had in some of those instances the same values or goals about people being able to if they were full-time workers being able to have the resources they need to take care of themselves, but some questions about how we got there. And so really by trying to like sift through some of the nuance and the details and doing that in those coalition spaces. So how are we making sure that we're looking at the needs of the smallest businesses, the needs of the medium-sized businesses, the needs of the nonprofits? Where are there opportunities for the largest corporate entities to maybe do this faster than some of the smallest businesses? Where is there education that's needed? So where is it that actually people, could do this on the timeline that's being proposed, but they didn't actually know what the timeline was. And so there was fear there that maybe wasn't even necessary fear because because some of the details weren't being clearly communicated out. So I think by looking at the overall goals and being in those relationships and communicating and trying to figure out the details, I will say that the solution that we got to, I don't think anybody was 100% happy with, but that we really tried hard to like find that sweet spot so that we were supporting people who were working full time and need to take care of their family. And then we're also addressing some specific needs of different kinds of businesses, especially those very small ones, and doing it in a way that brought people along and built community and emphasized relationships and communication. So I think that there definitely is a piece where you sometimes could take anyone who wrestles with text, right, knows that text can be read different ways sometimes. And so we might not always have the same reading of it, but how through that conversation together can we understand what each other's reading of it is and how can it help us kind of elucidate where we're going.
Yeah, I think that's so much of what we try to do here, right? Like take some text and spend some time with it and figure out how our own identity is coming through in our interpretations of it and thinking about it. You mentioned education there. We have a question thinking about what you mentioned with the ballot issues. There is even less media coverage of the ballot issues than for the down ballot candidates. So what can be done to provide more awareness and education of these important ballot issues?
Yeah. So first of all, there are a number of our partners, and I'm happy to provide links. I'm happy to throw some links in the chat or share them afterwards or whatever is helpful for people. But some of the ballot questions that I specifically have been talking about, there are groups, especially like CASA, who are doing education and both like events where it's education, but also doing door-to-door canvassing to really try to talk to people, in their neighborhoods about these issues and what's on the ballot. I think that that certainly one of the things that we look at trying to encourage people to do is write some of those articles. There's local media sources, those for sure I will.
If you want to share them with us, we can share them in the follow-up that'll include the recording and also the survey and things like that. So if you have,
great. I will do that. I will say one of the things that is really important that I'll put in the chat right now is that the media sources, what media sources you turn to is also incredibly important. So one of the things that especially the Gazette, for those of us who remember it years ago, provided some really good local reporting. Once that folded, then there really was a dearth. Baltimore Sun does do some good local reporting. Washington Post does very, very little. But Maryland Matters does wonderful work doing local reporting, as does for specifically Montgomery County issues. Bethesda Magazine does as well. It's called Bethesda Magazine, but it does it countywide. and also some of the newer, okay, I'll have to do some of the other ones. I don't have some of them. Here we go, like Baltimore Banner,
Yeah.
which just, and so, and there's
Yeah.
a couple other local sources in Baltimore as well. So by looking to those local media sources, rather than some of the, kind of big legacy papers,
Mhm.
and they are much more likely to run stories on things like the ballot questions. And I think that one of the things that we can do as people who care is to kind of encourage the media outlets to be writing on these type of issues to help educate people. And then sort of, so that like media strategy together with going door to door and really talking to our neighbors, combined with doing some amount of those educating, again, our own communities, as we've talked about before, it does put a lot of onus on us,
Yeah.
right? For us
Yeah.
to be involved and to be educating our communities. It's not, unlike so many things that are in the media where we can sort of read endless stories about inflation and gas prices,
Mhm.
we have to create the information and the opportunities around these democracy issues, especially at the local level, which is hard and tiring, but it is really important. And so that's why I appreciate opportunities like this to talk about ways for us to be working together to do that even more.
Yeah. We're going to finish with a question that sort of goes back to this idea of values and using your values voice. I appreciate that message, or that language that you all use, and your own identity. And this summer, there was a lot of questions about democracy and stories and all of these things. And so one of the things that we did was we encouraged people to tap into the wisdom from their own religious traditions. So I'm wondering, for you, what religious teaching, prayer, song, practice, tradition, ritual, figure, choose any of the above, has helped to fortify you in this work?
Yeah. So the quote that we at JFJ come back to over and over and over again is from Pirkei Avot, or the ethics of our ancestors, which is, it's not incumbent on you to finish the work, but you can't quit either.
Mm-hmm.
And we have it on our t-shirts. We have it, right? We have to keep coming back to it, because this work is a sprint and a marathon. The work, there is no end point. There is always more to do. It can, as I just said, it can feel really hard and overwhelming, the call to make that difference. So by knowing that it's like, we're not supposed to finish it, it's not all on us, it's not on any one of us, but collectively, it is all of our obligation. And so if we join together, then the idea many hands make lighter work. And so if we're all working on this together and we're doing that across lines of faith, and knowing sometimes we do have to step back and take care of ourselves and take a breather to sort of regroup and be able to come back into it. But having that long-term vision of, we've got to be in it, we've got to stay with it, even though it's never done. I find that to be reassuring and grounding, and it is something that we as a community can keep coming back to. And the one other way that we've been talking about that quote related to our civic engagement work is that no one election cycle is the end. Mm-hmm. It's not incumbent on you to finish the work or to complete the work. You can't quit either. It really has to do with the election cycles every 2 years, every 4 years, depending on your jurisdiction, how often they come up. Those cycles, each cycle is important, and none of them is an end in and of itself. There's always new things to learn. There's always new things to share. And so that's why it's important to stick with it cycle after cycle.
Thank you so much. I love that. Reminds me of a prayer that I used to turn to a lot in my teaching and work with students, and recognizing that I was with them for one part of their work or one part of their journey and not all of their journey. And the line that comes back over and over again: we plant the seeds that will one day grow. We water seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promise. We lay foundations that need further development. That's something that a refrain that I often have in my head too. So happy to hear a similar refrain. Laura, thank you so much for joining us today. Just want to give folks some quick announcements as we finish up. So when you exit this Zoom, a prompt will open in your browser window with a link to a survey on this event. Please click on that link and complete it while this experience is still fresh. We value our participants' opinions on our programming, and they really help us think about what to do next and designing our future programming. Be sure to visit our website, icjs.org, to donate, subscribe to our email list, and to learn about upcoming events. Again, icjs.org. And you will be able to find out all that information, including October's Mannequin Clark Lecture, American Muslims at a Crossroads, Navigating Identity in an Interreligious World with Dahlia Mugahed on October 24th. And then we have a course coming up in November taught by our Muslim scholar called Allah, Same as the Biblical God or Totally Other. And Laura, I want to give you an opportunity to shout out anything JUFJ has coming up, any events or actions or anything you want to.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's been really lovely being in conversation with you all today. We'll definitely have a bunch of links to share in the follow-up. And as I said, it will be an open invitation. If people are interested in the What's at Stake material for the general election when it's completed, we would love to share it with you. I also wanted to invite people who live anywhere in Maryland who are interested in our policy work at the state level. We have 2 kickoffs that we are doing this fall. The first one is during the holiday of Sukkot, the fall holiday of Sukkot. It will be held in Columbia Jewish Congregation outdoors in their sukkah and their hut at that festival harvest time of year, and that will be very relational and helping people to meet each other and start to know a little bit about how we work at the state level. And then the second one will be that's October 16th, and then actually the link I gave you is not going to go directly from Zoom. Let me try that one more time. The second kickoff that we have is going to be in November. Great, that should work. Is November 2nd. That one is on Zoom, and that's where we really go into depth into our issue agenda for the coming state session. We give people in the community the opportunity to weigh in on the different possible issues that we're looking at working on, to share what they're excited about and where they're excited for us to be putting our energies. All of that leading up to meetings with state legislators in December, and then our intense advocacy during the 3 months of the Maryland state session, which is January through April. So we sort of get started in October so that we're ready when session starts in January. We'll also do other education pieces along the way, but more than welcome anyone who would like to come. JUFJ's community is definitely Jewish community and allies. Definitely welcome folks to join us for either of those kickoffs in person or online.
Great. Laura, thank you again. And we look forward to continuing to learn. So thank you all. Have a great day, and we'll hope to see you soon.